You see, my friends, when I speak of death, I am not referring merely to the physical cessation of breath or heartbeat. Death is a symbol, an archetype. It is the eternal image of transformation, the threshold where one world dissolves into another. The fear of death that haunts humanity is not, at its root, a fear of non-existence. It is a fear of meaninglessness, the dead fear, oblivion, because the soul, even beyond the body, cannot exist without meaning. It is not annihilation the soul dreads, it is the void without purpose, the unbearable silence of unintegrated experience. The ancients understood this intuitively. They built entire civilizations upon their understanding of the afterlife. The pyramids, the tombs, the sacred rites, all were efforts to ensure that the journey beyond would not dissolve into chaos. They knew that the human being is not content with mere continuation. We long for continuity of meaning. The individual fears that death will erase not only the body but also the narrative, the story that gives coherence to existence. This fear of obliteration is the terror that the ego feels when it realizes that it was never the author of the story, only a chapter in a much older book. I have often said that modern man suffers from a loss of soul, but what does that truly mean? It means that we no longer live in a cosmos filled with symbols, gods, and living presences. We live instead in a universe of mechanisms, functions, and measurements. We have replaced mystery with explanation, but in doing so, we have starved the soul of nourishment. For the soul does not feed on data, it feeds on myth, on story, on the living tension between light and shadow. Without this tension, consciousness becomes thin, brittle, and afraid, and so we begin to fear death, not because it is death, but because we have already died spiritually long before the body ceases. In dreams, I have seen the dead. They do not come to frighten, but to teach. Often they appear not as ghostly apparitions, but as figures of wisdom or sorrow. They reveal that death is not the end, but a change in psychic condition. Yet even in the afterlife of the psyche, that subtle region of existence that transcends physical limits, the soul continues to strive toward integration. It continues to long for meaning, for reconciliation with all that was fragmented during life. This is why the dead sometimes return in dreams. They are not content. Their story is unfinished, their shadow unredeemed, their life not yet given full meaning. The soul is a storyteller. It cannot rest until it understands itself. This is why we fear oblivion, not because it threatens our continuation, but because it denies our story its final coherence. The greatest suffering of the modern soul is not pain, nor even despair. It is the absence of a symbolic framework through which suffering can become meaningful. For meaning is not found in happiness. Meaning is found in reconciliation with suffering. The cross, the phoenix, the serpent shedding its skin, all these ancient symbols remind us that renewal requires death, but death itself is never the end. Yet, when a man lives without relationship to his own unconscious, when he denies the existence of his inner world, he begins to live as though he were already dead. His days become mechanical repetitions of tasks and distractions. He becomes a ghost long before his burial, haunted by the unacknowledged depths within him. Such a person, when faced with actual death, feels an unutterable horror, for he senses that his life has been wasted, not because he lacked time, but because he lacked depth. I recall a dream told to me by a patient, a man who had lost his faith in everything in God, in love, in purpose. In the dream, he found himself walking through a barren field where the sky was gray and the soil was cracked. He saw a great pit before him, and from it rose a whispering wind that carried the voices of the dead. The wind said, "We are the forgotten ones, those who lived without knowing why." When he awoke, he was trembling. This dream was not simply an image of death, it was the revelation of a psychic truth, that when we live without meaning, our unlived potential becomes like the restless dead haunting the corridors of the unconscious, waiting for redemption. You must understand that the soul's need for meaning is not a luxury, it is its oxygen. Just as the body cannot live without air, the soul cannot survive without significance. The unconscious, that vast ocean beneath the ego, is filled with images, instincts, and forgotten memories that constantly seek expression. If we refuse them, if we silence them with the noise of reason or distraction, they rebel, they manifest as anxiety, neurosis, obsession, the symptoms of a soul deprived of purpose. The modern man who claims he no longer believes in God often does not realize that the God image has merely retreated into his unconscious. It continues to act upon him as fate. He becomes possessed by what he denies. His pursuit of pleasure, power, or perfection becomes a distorted form of worship. The gods he thought he outgrew now move in his instincts, driving him with the same urgency as before, only without the dignity of ritual or awareness. This is the secret tragedy of secular man. He thinks he has killed God, but he has only driven the divine into the shadows. And what is oblivion, if not the complete disconnection from one's inner world? To fear oblivion is to intuitively sense that the soul cannot survive estrangement from its own depths. Death, in its physical form, is inevitable, but psychic death, the death that comes from disconnection from one's purpose, is a choice made daily, quietly, through indifference. Every culture has known this truth in its own way. The Egyptians prepared their dead not just to survive the afterlife, but to retain meaning in it. The Tibetan Book of the Dead guides the soul through the intermediate state, teaching it how to recognize its own projections. Christianity speaks of resurrection not only as a promise of eternal life, but as the triumph of consciousness over unconsciousness, the integration of shadow into light. To fear oblivion, then, is not foolish. It is a symptom of the soul's hunger. It is the sacred anxiety that drives us to seek the eternal within the transient. The wise do not seek to eliminate this fear, but to transform it, to transmute fear into reverence, despair into understanding. I have observed in my patients that those who find meaning in their suffering no longer fear death as others do. They have made peace with the opposites within themselves. They have tasted the eternity that lies hidden in the present moment. The soul that has known itself is not afraid to pass beyond the veil, for it carries within it the light of consciousness. And consciousness is the bridge between worlds. When I speak of the afterlife, I do not mean a geographical realm somewhere beyond the stars. I mean the continuation of psychic life beyond the boundaries of the body, the subtle persistence of the archetypal patterns that shaped us. Just as the melody continues even after the instrument is broken, so does the essence of the soul continue after death. But what that essence becomes depends on how much consciousness we have cultivated in life. The unexamined soul remains bound to the earth, circling endlessly through the same patterns. The awakened soul, having embraced its own shadow and found meaning in suffering, moves freely through the cosmic field of being. So when I say that the dead fear oblivion, I mean that the part of us which remains unconscious fears the dissolution of its illusions. The ego, which believes itself to be the totality, cannot imagine existing beyond its own boundaries, and yet, paradoxically, it is through the ego's death that the self is born, the archetype of wholeness that is the true center of the psyche. In dreams, death often appears as a figure cloaked in shadow, or as a great sea, or as a door opening into light. The dream does not show the literal event, but the inner transformation, the movement of consciousness from the limited to the eternal. The soul's fear is never of death itself, but of awakening. For to awaken is to see that what we have called I was only a mask, and that beneath it, the timeless self has always been waiting. Yes, let us continue, for this journey cannot be halted midway. To stop at the threshold of understanding is to remain suspended in half-light seeing, but not yet knowing. You see, death as an archetype is never purely external. It exists within you now, as surely as life does. Every ending, every loss, every relinquishment of control, all are rehearsals for that final mystery. When a relationship collapses, when a dream fails, when youth fades, the psyche is invited into its own underworld. We are asked to descend, not as victims, but as initiates. In ancient mystery rites, the initiate was symbolically buried and later resurrected. This was not a primitive superstition. It was psychological truth, dramatized in sacred form. To die before you die is the essence of transformation. The soul must learn to yield, to allow the dissolution of old forms, so that something greater can emerge. That something is not new in the sense of novelty, it is ancient. eternal, the self that has awaited recognition since the beginning, but modern man has lost his capacity for initiation. He resists descent. He flees the underworld of his own unconscious, as though it were hell itself. And yet, my dear friends, what we call hell is nothing more than the rejected contents of the psyche, the shadows we refuse to integrate, the guilt we refuse to confront, the desires we pretended not to have. When these are not faced, they do not vanish. They become autonomous, haunting us in dreams, obsessions, and projections. Thus, in the dead, that is, the unconscious parts of ourselves fear oblivion because they have not yet been seen. They linger, they whisper, they ache for acknowledgement. The soul cannot rest until every part of it has been brought into the light of consciousness. Consider the symbol of Persephone, the maiden who was taken into the underworld by Hades to the rational mind. This is a tale of abduction, but to the psyche, it is a revelation. Persephone represents the feminine soul descending into the depths to retrieve her power. She becomes queen of the underworld, not its prisoner. Every individual must undergo a similar descent to claim sovereignty over their inner darkness. Those who refuse remain divided, caught between life and death, consciousness and shadow. It is in this way that oblivion becomes not merely a fear of ceasing to exist, but the terror of never having lived truly, of remaining a fragmented consciousness, never whole, never real. I have seen this pattern countless times in analysis. A man dreams of being buried alive, another of walking through an endless hallway where the lights are going out one by one. A woman dreams of drowning, of sinking into dark waters where faces of the dead reach toward her. These are not prophecies of physical death. They are the psyche's language, symbolic expressions of the ego's confrontation with the unconscious. When the ego refuses the invitation to descend, the energy of the unconscious turns destructive. But when one dares to enter the darkness, consciously, the same energy becomes redemptive. For in that descent lies the secret of renewal, the alchemical nigredo, the blackening of the soul that precedes illumination. Death, in this symbolic sense, is the companion of individuation. You cannot be born into wholeness unless you are willing to let die what is false. What is merely a persona, a social mask, but the ego fears this death because it mistakes itself for the totality. It clings to its illusions as if to life itself. Thus, the greatest act of courage is to let go, to allow the old self to disintegrate so that the self, the divine center, may emerge. When you dream of death, you are not dreaming of your extinction, but of your transformation. The unconscious speaks in the language of symbols, and death is its most profound metaphor for change. It says, something within you is ready to end. Will you allow it? Those who cannot answer yes live half-lives. They remain at the surface, fearful of the depths. They seek immortality not through the soul, but through substitution, fame, possessions, endless stimulation. Yet these are only reflections on the surface of the water, and they vanish the moment the wind changes. True immortality belongs only to the inner life, to the consciousness that has reconciled opposites within itself. The fear of oblivion, then, is the fear of meaninglessness. Yes, but also the fear of facing the whole truth of one's being. For to face the unconscious is to encounter not only divinity but also monstrosity. In every soul there exists both the saint and the murderer, the creator and the destroyer, the divine child and the shadowed beast. It is the task of consciousness to hold these opposites, to allow the tension without collapsing into one side. Do you see? Heaven and hell are psychological realities. They are not distant realms, but conditions of consciousness. Heaven is the harmony of opposites. Hell is their refusal. When we project our inner darkness outward onto other people, other nations, other religions, we create literal hells on earth. The wars of the world are nothing more than collective shadows taking form. In analysis, when a man finally sees his shadow, truly sees it, not as an enemy, but as part of himself, something miraculous occurs. He feels both terror and relief. Terror, because he realizes the depths of his capacity for evil. Relief, because he knows now that it is his own and therefore redeemable. Only that which is owned can be transformed. It is the same with death. Only when we accept death as part of life can it become our teacher instead of our tyrant. The soul does not fear death once it understands that death is merely the shadow of transformation. The fear of oblivion dissolves when we recognize that meaning is eternal, even when form is not. I recall once dreaming of a vast sea at dusk. The horizon was crimson, and the waves were black glass. Upon the shore stood a figure cloaked in gold, holding a lamp. I asked, "Who are you?" The figure replied, "I am that which remains when all else falls away." I awoke with tears in my eyes. That dream revealed to me that there is something within the human spirit that does not perish, not because it resists death, but because it transcends it. That something is what I call the self, the image of God within the soul. But to reach that realization, one must walk through the valley of shadow. One must face oblivion consciously. To live a full life is to continually die to what is no longer alive within us. Each day demands a small death of pride, of certainty, of old beliefs. To refuse these deaths is to become fossilized. To embrace them is to be reborn continually. Therefore, the true fear of the dead and of the living who are inwardly dead is not oblivion, but unfinishedness. The unlived life cries out from the depths. It says, "You did not become who you could have been," and that cry echoes across eternity until it is answered. This is why dreams of the dead are so often dreams of reconciliation. A parent long deceased appears to say what was left unsaid. A friend lost to tragedy returns in silence, radiating forgiveness. The psyche seeks completion. The dead come not to haunt, but to heal. They are fragments of our own totality seeking reintegration. You must understand, consciousness is the only light strong enough to redeem shadow. The unconscious is timeless, and therefore so are its wounds. What we refuse to heal in this life may follow us beyond it, as patterns, as longings, as unfinished symbols. This is why the soul yearns so desperately for meaning. It knows that only through meaning can the fragments of existence be made whole. The ancient mystics were right. The soul's journey is circular. What begins in birth returns in death, and what is not completed returns again, not necessarily in physical reincarnation, but in psychic repetition. History itself is a mirror of the collective unconscious, repeating its unresolved patterns, the same wars, the same delusions, the same hunger for gods and idols. The collective, like the individual, cannot bear the thought of meaninglessness, and so it creates endless myths to avoid the abyss. But the abyss must be faced. Only then does it reveal its true nature, not as void, but as womb. The darkness we fear is the matrix of transformation. The ego calls it oblivion, the soul calls it creation. So you see, the dead do not fear annihilation, they fear being forgotten, being unintegrated, being reduced to symbols never understood, and the living who deny the depth of their inner world share the same fate. They live in exile from their own souls. To face death consciously is the final act of individuation. It is to see without terror that the drop and the ocean are one and the same. When one reaches the brink of death, whether in dream or in body, one faces not extinction but exposure. The masks fall away, the images dissolve, the noise of the world recedes, and in that vast silence the soul stands naked before itself. Many imagine this as judgment, a tribunal of divine authority, but in truth it is reflection. The soul sees itself as it truly is, unfiltered by the illusions of the ego. Every act, every omission, every denial of truth, all are gathered like mirrors around it. And what the soul fears in that moment is not punishment, but emptiness, for it realizes that every unlived truth, every denied emotion, every unintegrated shadow has become a hollow space within it. These empty spaces echo like tombs the architecture of a life that might have been whole. This is the deeper meaning of oblivion, the echoing silence of a self never made conscious. You see, what survives death is not the personality, not the name or the face, but the essence of consciousness itself, the degree to which the individual became aware of their own depths. Consciousness is the only form of immortality the psyche knows. It is not personal in the narrow sense. It is the return of awareness to the eternal field from which it came. The more consciousness one has gathered in life, the more luminous the passage beyond becomes. In this sense, the soul is like a vessel sailing into infinity. Some vessels are filled with gold, others with sand, and some are nearly empty, though they may have seemed magnificent from the shore. The gold of the soul is not virtue in the moral sense, but awareness, the honest encounter with one's own darkness and light, those who have looked upon themselves without flinching, who have wrestled with their angels and demons alike, carry with them the fullness of being. I recall a woman who came to me, tormented by nightmares. In each dream, she stood before a mirror, but no reflection appeared. She felt a terror unlike anything in waking life, the terror of invisibility. When we explored this image, she wept and said, "It's as though I don't exist unless someone sees me." In that moment, she touched the essence of the modern neurosis, the fear of non-being, of existing without witness or purpose. The dream was not about vanity. It was about the hunger for meaning. For to be seen, truly seen, is to be made real. And what the unconscious seeks is precisely that, recognition by consciousness. When this recognition does not occur, the soul begins to fragment. Its images, its archetypes, its forgotten pains drift into the unconscious like the unburied dead. These are what the ancients called shades, the restless spirits that wander between worlds. But they are not outside of us. They are the disowned parts of ourself. They wander because we refuse them burial, the ritual of understanding. To bury a complex is not to repress it, but to consecrate it, to acknowledge its place in the total story of one's being. The greatest danger of our age is not material death, but psychic amnesia. We have forgotten the language of symbols, and therefore we no longer know how to speak to our own souls. We think in terms of consumption and production, but not of meaning. The sacred has been replaced by spectacle, and the infinite has been reduced to the measurable. Yet beneath this glittering illusion, the unconscious continues its silent work, demanding acknowledgement. It speaks in anxiety, in depression, in inexplicable grief. These are not pathologies to be eliminated, but messages to be interpreted. A man once told me, "I am haunted by a sense that nothing matters." I said to him, "That is the voice of your soul asking for meaning. The void is not your enemy, it is your initiation." You see, despair is often the beginning of real transformation, for it strips away false comfort. When all external meaning collapses, one must turn inward, and it is there, in the abyss, that one finds the seed of eternity. The fear of oblivion, then, is not a weakness, but a signal. It points toward the necessity of transcendence. Every symbol of death in myth, the descent of Inanna, the crucifixion of Christ, the burial of Osiris reveals the same pattern. The soul must die to the surface world in order to be reborn into the deeper reality. The seed must fall into the earth, rot, and disappear before it can sprout anew. So it is with consciousness. You cannot reach immortality through denial. You cannot cling to life and expect eternity. Only by surrendering the ego's illusion of control does the eternal become visible. This is why mystics and sages across cultures have spoken of dying before death to meet the divine, not as a stranger, but as oneself. I have often thought that the afterlife is less a location than a state of recognition. The soul awakens to the realization that everything it encountered, every person, every event, every joy and wound was a mirror reflecting some aspect of its own nature. Nothing was meaningless. Everything was a dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious, between the human and the divine. But to reach that realization beyond death, one must begin it in life. Otherwise, the psyche remains bound to repetition. It returns to the same conflicts, the same fears, the same hunger for redemption. In this way, the myth of reincarnation is psychologically true, even if not literally so. The soul repeats what it has not understood. Every unfinished story must be lived again until consciousness completes it. The fear of oblivion is therefore the soul's intuition that it has not yet told its story to completion. In dreams, I have seen souls wandering through gray landscapes, searching for a light that is not outside them but within. They approach doors that lead nowhere, corridors that loop endlessly. These are the images of unintegrated life. The dead in these dreams are not damned. They are waiting for awareness, for meaning, for the light of consciousness to guide them home. I once experienced a vision during an illness. When my body was near collapse, I saw a great tree whose roots extended into darkness and whose branches reached beyond the stars. Between the roots and the branches flowed rivers of light, pulsing with rhythm like breath. I understood then that life and death are not opposites, but reciprocities, inhalation and exhalation of the eternal. The soul moves between these poles as rhythm, not as tragedy. What the ego calls oblivion, the self knows as rest. What the ego calls loss, the self knows as transformation. The terror of non-being arises only when consciousness is still bound to identification with body, role, possession, name. When you realize that the essence of you is not any of these, but the witnessing awareness itself, fear dissolves. You begin to understand that even death cannot destroy what was never separate. To live rightly, therefore, is to die continuously, to shed identity after identity until only essence remains. This shedding is painful, yes, for the ego resists dissolution, but each small death brings greater freedom. The one who learns this art, the art of conscious dying, no longer fears the final passage. He knows that the gate of death opens not into nothingness, but into expansion. The soul's desperate need for meaning, then, is its instinctive knowledge that it is eternal. Meaning is the bridge between time and timelessness. Through meaning, the finite participates in the infinite. When we lose meaning, we are not simply confused, we are exiled from the eternal. And that exile, that feeling of isolation from the greater whole, is the true source of our fear. But meaning cannot be manufactured. It cannot be found in dogma or ideology. It must be discovered individually through encounter with the unconscious, through dreams, through symbols, through the honest facing of one's suffering. The unconscious speaks in images older than civilization: the serpent, the sea, the mountain, the womb, To translate these images into understanding is to participate in the mystery of creation itself. And so, when the dead appear in dreams, when the forgotten emotions rise from the depths, they are asking not to be worshipped, but to be understood. They are fragments of the divine story, waiting for the light of awareness. The work of consciousness is the work of resurrection, the raising of the dead within us. Thus, when you next feel the chill of meaninglessness, do not run. Sit with it. Listen. Beneath its silence, you will hear the whisper of eternity, calling you to remember who you are. For the soul that knows itself fears nothing, not even death. It walks through the threshold with the serenity of one returning home. And now, as we approach the final turn in the spiral, let us linger in the silence that always follows understanding. For in that silence, the deepest truths begin to speak everywhere. Death teaches. It teaches not through cruelty, but through precision. It strips away illusion with ruthless clarity, the withering leaf, the fading light, the stillness after storm, all whisper the same eternal message. Nothing real can be lost. Only the false dies. What is essential transforms. What is unconscious returns to the source from which it came, waiting to be born again in new form. If we could accept this, not as doctrine, but as direct experience, the fear of oblivion would vanish like mist before the sun. We would see that death is not the enemy of life, but its invisible twin, the one that ensures every moment matters. Without death, life would lose its intensity, its sacredness, its flame. It is the knowledge of impermanence that makes meaning possible, and yet the soul trembles, not because it doubts eternity, but because it senses the vast responsibility that comes with consciousness. To be aware is to be accountable. The soul knows that meaning is not given. It must be created moment by moment, breath by breath, through the courage to see, to feel, to suffer, and to love. I have said before that meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. But it does more than that. Meaning transforms endurance into creation. When suffering acquires meaning, it ceases to be mere pain. It becomes participation in a mystery. It becomes, if I may use a word from alchemy, opus, the sacred work. We are, each of us, the alchemists of our own lives. The base metal we are given is our mortality, our fear, our shadow. Through awareness and integration, we transmute it into gold, the gold of understanding, compassion, and connection with the eternal self. The philosopher's stone that the ancient mystics sought was not an object but a state of consciousness, the realization that spirit and matter are not opposites but reflections. Death is the final alchemy. It is the moment when the opposites, life and cessation, form and formlessness, individual and whole, are reconciled. The fear of oblivion is simply the ego's resistance to this union. The ego wishes to preserve itself, but the self wishes to expand And when expansion occurs, what was small and separate dissolves into the totality of being. Imagine, if you will, standing upon the shore of an infinite ocean. You hold a single drop of water in your palm. You cherish it, fear losing it. Yet, when it slips through your fingers, you realize it was never lost. It returned to the ocean where it belonged all along. So it is with the soul. The drop fears dissolution, but the ocean rejoices in reunion. The dead, therefore, fear oblivion, not because they are lost, but because they have not yet remembered. They cling to the fragments of their former selves, to identities, to stories, to unfulfilled desires. They hover near the world of the living because they have not completed the circle of consciousness. The work of the living of those who dare to awaken is to complete that circle not after death, but within life, to live as if each day were both beginning and ending simultaneously. Birth and burial is to transcend the duality of existence. I have observed, in rare moments of deep analysis, the light that emerges when a person truly understands the meaning of their suffering. It is as though the soul begins to shine through the eyes. One patient, after years of grief, said to me quietly, "I see now that I was not being punished. I was being asked to grow." That single sentence contained the seed of immortality, for it revealed that she had entered into dialogue with the eternal. The dead cannot fear oblivion. Once meaning is found, because meaning binds time to eternity. The body dies, the name fades, the world moves on, but the meaning remains, woven into the invisible fabric of existence. Every act of love, every moment of awareness, every truth faced with courage becomes part of the collective soul of humanity. Nothing conscious is ever lost. I often think of meaning as a flame passed from one soul to another. We do not possess it. We tend it. It burns through us for a time, illuminating our path. And when we are gone, it continues in others. The work of the soul is to keep that flame alive, to prevent it from being smothered by indifference or cynicism. To live without meaning is to let the flame go out. To live with meaning is to join the great procession of those who have carried light through the corridors of time. In one of my last dreams, I found myself walking through a vast library with no walls, the shelves stretched into infinity. Each book glowed faintly, and I understood that every soul was a volume in this endless archive of being. Some books were unfinished, their pages blank, waiting for consciousness to inscribe them. Others were complete luminous, warm, radiant. And then I saw that the library itself was alive, breathing, pulsating with a rhythm of creation. Death, I realized, is only the closing of one book so that another may open. When I awoke, I felt a strange peace. The fear of oblivion dissolved like smoke, and in its place was wonder, the quiet recognition that existence is both fragile and eternal, fleeting and infinite. The dead do not disappear. They transform into meaning, into memory, into symbol. They become part of the myth that sustains the living. You must understand, myth is not fantasy. Myth is the living language of the unconscious. It is how eternity communicates with time. When you dream, when you create, when you love deeply, you are participating in myth and therefore in eternity. To find meaning in one's own myth is to transcend death itself. So I say to you, do not seek to escape death, but to understand it. Do not cling to life, but to meaning. For meaning is the bridge between the worlds. When the hour of death comes, it will not ask what you owned or achieved, but what you understood, what you integrated, what you made conscious. If you have met yourself, your shadow, your pain, your divine image, you will not fear oblivion. You will recognize it as the threshold of transformation, the final initiation. You will cross it as one who has already died 1,000 small deaths and therefore knows the way. In that final moment when all forms dissolve, the soul does not vanish, it expands. It becomes the stillness from which all movement arises, the silence from which all sound is born. It becomes what it always was, the eternal witness of its own becoming. And so, my friends, the truth is simple, though it may take a lifetime to learn. Death does not end, meaning and death